So, yeah. So, hi, hello everyone, to all of us that are here at FLAD, and all of that we can see, not now, but we know that are in our Zoom meeting. In FLAD's name, my name is Rita Fada and I'm FLAD's president. I just want to say welcome. It's an honor and it's a pleasure once again to receive WIIS Women in International Security event at FLAD. We have been cooperating with Ana Gomes and the Portuguese section of WIIS for many times, and it's always a great pleasure for us to have you here. So, Ana Gomes, please.
Well, thank you. It's Rita again for hosting us on behalf of FLAD. It's really a privilege for us to be able to rely on your support. I would like to welcome not only those of us who are here present in the room, but those who are all over the world actually following us. We're quite happy today to resume our WIIS sessions with having as guest speaker Ms. Benedetta Berti, who is a policy advisor and consultant with NATO. She serves now as head of policy planning in the office of the Secretary General of NATO. And she's been, as an academic, and a researcher, a consultant, quite experienced with working in Europe, in the US, working and studying in the EU, in the US, in working with also with NGOs and in research institutes in Latin America, the Middle East and the US, focusing on human rights, internal conflict and political violence. And her areas of expertise include human security, internal conflict, integration of armed groups, post-conflict stabilization and peace building, as well as violence prevention and reduction and crisis management and prevention. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Benedetta Berti with us to talk and to make us understand better what the new strategic concept of NATO involves. And I must thank Lieutenant Diana Moraes. She's not here with us because unfortunately she's been kept busy in the Ministry of Defense, some activity, but she has been, she's our Vice President of WIIS. Together with Luso-Americana, with our Secretary General, they've been working hard to make this session happen. And she established the contact with Dr. Benedetta Berti, whom she knows well. And I'm very sorry that she's not here with us at the moment, but I hope that she will come in time and will not miss the opportunity that she has afforded us by having Dr. Benedetta Berti agree to be with us today. I think your presentation is going to be very important for us because, of course, we are now in the middle of a war that involves the whole world, although some people keep denying it. But those of us in Europe, we understand this is indeed a war that has global implications, and it has crucial implications for those of us who are really attached to democracy and the rule of law and human rights and justice. And that it's in this context that, of course, the role of NATO has gained in importance, that the change, the evolution with the new strategic concept, let's see how it indeed serves the new, the current challenges we have with this war in which NATO, although not directly involved, despite all the propaganda that the Russians try to spread, NATO is not directly involved, but it is, of course, very much concerned and is being supportive of the defense, the extraordinary, heroic defense effort by Ukraine, and providing all sorts of support, but as well seeing itself being enlarged as a consequence, because of course both Sweden and Finland are joining the alliance exactly because they better than anyone else understand what is at stake and how important it is to join those who fight to ally for freedom against an imperialistic, totalitarian, fascist aggressor. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Benedetta Berti, and we will feel free to take the time that you need, and then I'm sure that we will have time for questions and answers after your presentation. So, Dr. Benedetta Berti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me. If not, okay, I see a lot of nodding, so I'll just take that as a yes. If there is any audio, I will. Perfect. So, with your permission, I think I'm going to take 15-20 minutes just to give an overview, at least from where I sit, from how I see it, about the importance of NATO's 2022 strategic concept, maybe a couple of words of how we got there, and highlight some of what I think are the most important policy changes, and that should give us then quite a lot of food for thought, hopefully, and then also leave us some time for Q&A or just for engaging, because that's often the most interesting part of any lecture. So I'll try not to be too elaborate. But with that, let me just start by saying that, well, first of all, by thanking you again for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here virtually. It would be even more of a pleasure to be there in person, but I guess next time we'll arrange it. So yeah, so the strategic concept. What's all the fuss about? Let's put it that way. And of course, just as a parenthesis, from my vantage point, I've had policy planning in the Office of the Secretary General. We've had the privilege to lead the effort on the Secretary General's behalf, of course, to, first of all, to collect all the input for the drafting of the strategic concept, then to write the first draft, and then, of course, to support the allies, the 30 NATO allies, as they negotiated and agreed a final text that was then endorsed by our heads of state and government when they met in Madrid just a few months ago at the end of June for the 2022 NATO summit. So I think that the reason why we are taking a few minutes of our time to think about the strategic concept is clear. This is in terms of what NATO is, how the strategic concept is a window into NATO's strategic thinking. I would say that it's a very important document. It is the second, if you look at the hierarchical structure of NATO documents, it's the second most important one after the North Atlantic Treaty, which set the alliance up. So in that sense, it's very, it has a prominent role in NATO's hierarchy of documents. It is, if there is any expression of the alliance grand strategy, then I think you find it in the short text of the strategic concept. The main purpose really is to tell ourselves as allies, our citizens, but also our partners and potential adversaries, what NATO is, what are our main values, how do we collectively assess the security environment, so the main threats, the main challenges, how do we see the world, in other words, and what do we think the alliance should be doing about the security threats that we all collectively identify. So in that sense, I think it's quite, it serves a many function, just a strategic function, a political function, a public communication function since the end of the Cold War, because of course, during the Cold War, we had 4 strategic concepts, but those were secret and they were mostly military, drafted by the military structures and really focused only on deterrence and defense. Since the end of the Cold War, we've had 3 concepts that I think were very different in nature. First of all, they weren't military, they weren't written by the military, they were written by the civilian authority. They were public, so they also play a role of public strategic communication. and they reflected a much broader understanding of security. So if during the Cold War it was a quite simple understanding, one main threat, one main theater, one main challenge, in the three post-Cold War concepts that you had before 2022, really you see this broadening of the understanding of security, you see the broadening of NATO's main functions, and then of course, this culminates in 2010 with the last concept that talks about NATO as this political military alliance that has three core tasks and really looks at deterrence and collective defense, looks at crisis management and cooperative security. I start with all this because I think it's often a good starting point to look at what we had agreed in 2010 and then to compare it with what we agreed in 2022, because to me that is the greatest way to understand the changes in the alliance really since 2010, and specifically I would say since 2014 and Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, which really marked a watershed in our strategic thinking and the beginning of a reset, if you wish, back to collective defense in a way that we hadn't done for decades. So what do I mean is that if you take the three post-Cold War concepts, and especially the 2010 one, you can see that they really reflect a different understanding of the strategic environment. The 2010 concept starts by saying the Euro-Atlantic area is at peace, the risk of conflict involved, the risk of conventional war is low. And of course, that concept doesn't say that we will not face threats and challenges to our security, but it essentially says the Euro-Atlantic area is stable, it's an area of cooperation, stability, peace. Threats and challenges will come from outside of the Euro-Atlantic area. We will be threatened mostly through asymmetric means, terrorism, and we will threats like terrorism. And to respond to these, we will have to really invest in boosting our ability to do crisis management, to do operations at strategic distance, and of course, back at the time, Afghanistan was the largest operational deployment for NATO. That concept also talks about the importance of building a strategic partnership with Russia, and it talks really, and it really very eloquently expresses this post-Cold War peace dividend mindset, the mindset that the Euro-Atlantic area is fundamentally an area of stability, and that fundamentally we have to worry from threats that come from outside of the area. I start with this because we really deliberately looked at the tests in 2010 and wanted the 2022 concept to reflect that we are no longer in that post-Cold War era. We are no longer in that time of peace dividend. So we started 2022 strategic assessment basically by saying the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. All the assumptions that had been so central to our understanding of security over the past 3 decades, they don't work anymore. We have full-fledged war in Europe, of course because of Russia's actions in Ukraine. We have instability that will very likely be a defining feature of our security environment in the long term. We have the rise of strategic competition, the return of great power competition, and we are facing a security environment where simply the notion that Europe is done and we are in an era of peace and stability simply cannot be taken for granted anymore. So for me, that's probably, if I had to summarize the ethos of the new concept, I really always start with this contrast because I think it's really, really important, and it hopefully we'll see, of course, the proof of all concepts, it's in the planning and in the actions, but I think conceptually, this should indicate that as an alliance, we have turned a corner and we are very much aware that we are in a different security environment. It's much more complex, much more competitive, much more unstable and volatile than the post-Cold War 30 years we've had in the past. And therefore, we need to dramatically rethink how we see collective defense, the importance of collective defense, and we have to dramatically emphasize the importance of not having the luxury of taking our own security and defense for granted. So if I start from that general tone, I think the 2022 concept is much more realist compared to 2010. It really tells us we are in a different situation and we need to face the music. Perhaps we haven't to the full extent that we should have in the past, but now it's really time to adapt. And of course, that leads to some significant policy changes from NATO. The first, I would say, it's on Russia. Again, 2010 talked about a strategic partnership with Russia. That's a very noble sentiment, but the reality is that since 2014, we have been in a constant process of intensification of tensions with the Russian Federation because of its actions. And right now we are in a situation where we cannot talk about Russia as a partner. The strategic concept says that clearly, but it's a little bit more specific. It says today, the Russian Federation is the most direct threat to our security as allies and to European and to Euro-Atlantic peace and stability. So it's very, very different from the language you had 12 years ago. That's of course because of reality. Of course, the wake-up call wasn't the beginning of the war in Ukraine in February. It was the annexation of Crimea. We've been dealing with that for almost a decade, but I think in this concept it's very clear that it says because of the aggressive behavior that we've seen over the last years, culminating in this fully fledged war, we have to be very clear-eyed about the Russian threat, and we need to invest in our deterrence and defense. We need to boost our resilience and that of our partners to counter malign interference and coercion. And yes, we will maintain open channels of communication because we have the key goal of preserving stability, but at the same time, we cannot talk about dialogue. There is no dialogue right now. This is not the phase we're in. And I think it's a very stark contrast from where we were. Again, it's a reflection of reality, right? So that's a big area of change. The second big area of change is it's in general how the strategic concept talks specifically about strategic competition. It's not a terminology that you have seen in NATO before. So now we talk about how if we look ahead, we are seeing that we're going to be challenged more and more by authoritarian assertive powers, and that competition will be across the spectrum. Military, ideological, political, diplomatic, economic, technological. So it's much broader. And of course, when we talk about strategic competition, we cannot ignore the People's Republic of China. And that's another really important change in the strategic concept. This is the first time in 73 years that a NATO strategy deals with China. And so I think that's it's also one of the topics that was picked the most in the media because it's new, but I also think it's quite important. And again, on China, the strategic concept doesn't say China is an adversary. It doesn't use the language of threat like Russia, but instead, we see China's, the People's Republic of China coercive behavior on the international stage as a systemic challenge. And we see that systemic challenge has an impact on Euro-Atlantic security. So that's particularly, I think, worth noting because it signals a change from what we had in the past. The point on China that emerges from the strategic concept is there is a transatlantic dimension to this challenge, and there is an important role for the transatlantic community to come together when it comes to addressing the security impact of China's rise. And we'll do that through working together to increase our situational awareness, working together to increase our resilience, working with our partners, including in the Asia Pacific, and increasing the work we do to stand up for the rules-based international order. So these are all new themes that you find in the concept. And then, of course, compared to 2010, there's also a series of other themes that are new. For example, in 2010, we talked about the threat of terrorism as one of the key threats to the Euro-Atlantic area. That remains very much the case in the 2022 concept. But now we're also talking about the importance of tackling the broader instability, that conflict, and situations that lead to the proliferation of armed groups, including terrorism. So it's a broader conceptualization. And then, of course, compared to 2010, this concept takes much more seriously cyber threats, hybrid threats, threats from space, and the security impact of climate change. In 2010, we had one line saying that basically environmental security mattered, which was at the time already quite forward-leaning, but of course in 2022 that was absolutely not enough. So in 2022 our concept puts climate change as one of the defining security challenges for the Alliance, both directly because of its impact on the Euro-Atlantic area, indirectly because how it affects conflict and stability in our periphery, and also because it fundamentally presents challenges to our armed forces and will have to be taken into account as they adapt. So the place of climate change is a lot more prominent. And then last but absolutely not least, I would say, especially given this particular event, this is the first NATO strategic concept where the role of integrating mainstream gender perspective is recognized as a key strategic enabler of all our core tasks. Never there's been a NATO strategy that talks about the role of gender perspectives. In this one, we were quite proud as an alliance that we were able to put the concept of human security and gender perspective as at the center of the analysis and basically say we need to integrate these in everything we do. It cannot be an ad hoc, it needs to be really embedded into the way we think about security threats and challenges. So for us, it was also quite forward-leaning, and we're quite happy about that. Then from this thorough description of the strategic environment, the strategic concept basically tells us what we should be doing for the next 10 years. And I don't think there's any great surprise in saying the first main message is we need to continue to reset back to collective defense. In other words, after a few decades in which we were we lost a little bit focus on territorial defense, on conventional defense, on deterrence and defense, because the reality made us think that we didn't need to do that anymore. Now we really need to put that back at the very center of our thinking. Again, the strategic concept is not the beginning of that process. That process of military adaptation really started in 2014, but this concept is about recognizing it, codifying it, and hopefully help accelerating that adaptation. So through the lens of collective defense, which we basically say this is NATO's purpose. We don't have many purposes, we have one, ensuring the collective defense of allies. And to do that, we will do 3 core tasks. So here we go back to the 3 layers. The first one is deterrence and defense. And I would say if you compare it to 2010, it is clear that we're recognizing that in this security environment, we really need to put deterrence and defense front and center of how we think about defense and security, and front and center of our adaptation as NATO. But I also would really emphasize that this is not a going back to the Cold War understanding of deterrence and defense. We're talking about conventional, of course. We're talking about missile defense. We're talking about nuclear, absolutely. But we're also talking about cyber. We're also talking about space. And very importantly, we're talking about resilience as a key enabler of our ability to do deterrence and defense. So it's a different framing, and I would say much broader and much more in line with our security environment of today. Resilience is definitely a key topic in the strategic concept, and it's not just the resilience of our physical and digital infrastructure, it's also the resilience of our it's also the ability to invest in understanding and mitigating strategic dependencies, being related to energy security, but also related to technologies, to key assets in industry. So it's really about recognizing that in a world of strategic competition, everything is related to everything, and the vulnerabilities in our society, in our infrastructure, in our 5G, in our civilian satellite, can have an impact on our security. So that's definitely something that we haven't tackled before to the same extent. And then I'll say 2 other words and stop, just not to take too much of your time with the introduction to the strategic concept. The other 2 core tasks are preserved from 2010, but I would say slightly updated. The second is, of course, crisis. In 2010, we talked about crisis management. Today we talk about crisis prevention management. It's maybe just a word, but it's actually quite important because it means that we are more and more recognizing that the most sustainable way to deal with crises outside of the Euro-Atlantic area is by working with our partners. It's through capacity building, it's training, it's about supporting their efforts to deal with their security challenges and with their security threats, and investing in a prevention toolkit. So of course, NATO as an alliance needs to remain able to deploy and to sustain and coordinate multinational deployments at strategic distance, including for counterterrorism if need be. But our main focus will be how to build the ability of our partners and those on the ground to respond to their security challenges. So the prevention agenda is much stronger than it was in the past. And connected to that, of course, there is the recognition, just like in 2010, that we don't live in a world in which we have the luxury to try to tackle all the security threats and challenges we face in isolation. And that's why we need cooperative security, and we need to continue to work with our partners. And that's incredibly important because we recognize that today many of the threats we face are global. They don't recognize borders. Think of cyber attacks, think of hybrid, think of terrorism, think of climate change. All these important threats we face, of course, can only be tackled by collaborating, by cooperating, and by building partnerships. So the final part of the strategic concept really, I think, leads in the idea that partnerships are our most important political tool as an alliance, and then we have to strengthen them. And I think you can see that there's a few groups of countries that we are placing a focus on. One is, of course, aspirant countries, countries that hope to join, aspire for membership of NATO. And of course, you know, it's Ukraine, Georgia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is in the context of how can we support more consistently and more strongly vulnerable partners in our neighborhood, especially to counter malign interference, coercion, and eventually aggression. So that's how we can. And of course, our main effort right now is Ukraine, to support them for as long as it's needed. But the reflection in the strategic concept is how can we really do more for vulnerable partners in our neighborhood. A second group of partners that is emphasized is those we call like-minded partners. So partners with whom we can work together to stand up for the rules-based international order. And this is the first NATO strategy in which our Indo-Pacific partners are highlighted. The word Indo-Pacific, it's not a word that you would have found in any other NATO strategy. Here we're talking about the importance of strengthening ties with our Indo-Pacific partners, but also recognizing that the two theaters, Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, are connected. The security of one affects the other, so there are relations there that we need to take into consideration. And then, of course, more continuity than change. We talk about the importance of strengthening partnerships with our partners in our southern neighborhood, and in the optic of contributing to stabilization and countering terrorism. And to do that, also to work more closely with other international organizations. And of course, I need to say a word about the European Union, which is really flagged in our strategic concept as a NATO key strategic partner. And we have a very, I would say, ambitious agenda for how to continue to really build our cooperation on issues of strategic relevance, including the security impact of the rise of China. So this is a little bit of an overview. In terms of the key themes, the key policy changes, and the key direction of travel. I think that compared to 2010, and I'll stop here, you see it's a much more somber, much more realist, but that's of course because that's the security environment we live in. Probably the strongest point of continuity, and that's a continuity that I think you find in all strategic concepts, and that's of course deliberate, is in highlighting the importance of thinking about our alliance as a military alliance, as a political alliance, but also as an alliance of values, and the importance of strengthening that value-based dimension to how we approach the security threats and challenges that we face. So you will find many references to the importance of upholding our values, upholding international humanitarian law, strengthening our investment in good governance, and working on our democratic resilience. So these are also, it's also a way to to highlight that the more we go into a world of strategic competition, the more, of course, we also have to take care of ourselves and our own democracies, because those are incredible, because maintaining their strength and vitality remains incredibly important to our success as a military alliance. So we try to underline these links as well. And I think for the sake of time, I'll stop here. So I hope I was able to address the main topics, but it's a short document, but has a lot of topics in it. So these are my highlights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Benedetta Berti. It was really fascinating to hear you, and I'm sure you have elicited a lot of questions from our friends. So I think I'll open immediately the floor to those who want to ask questions or make comments. And we'll try to do one person here and one person who's in the following it outside of this room via internet. So, any questions? Huh? Go ahead. I would ask you to introduce yourselves, just so that everybody has an idea. And I would like to ask those friends who want to raise your hands. You're virtually. Okay. Yeah? Let's start with you, Luisa, and then we'll give I can't read, I'm sorry.
Your Nana.
I miss my...
Wayne Green. Green. No.
Okay, Luisa, go ahead. Introduce yourselves, please. Then it will be Joanna, who was from... I have to, it's the only way to get to see a little bit more. Okay.
Dr. Benedetta Berti.
Introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is Luisa, we've spoken. I was also a speaker at the NATO Youth Summit, and so I presented a policy pitch on the implementation of WPS in the new strategic concept. And now I guess this is my opportunity to turn the tables and ask you, what do you think the next steps are for NATO to implement WPS, since it has taken a center stage, as you've mentioned, in the strategic concept, but I'm wondering what that can actually look like in terms of policy implementation. Thank you.
Shall we get another question, and then we'll hand it to two more questions, and then we hand it to Dr. Benedetta. Joanna?
Hello, thank you. My name is Joanna. I was also a participant at PACE, at the Portuguese Atlantic Youth Seminar. And my question is regarding the instability rising with Kosovo and Serbia, and also Azerbaijan and Armenia. What is NATO's strategy and plans for these instabilities that are rising? Thank you very much.
And now it's I'm
Wayne.
Wayne, will you
Thank you very much indeed. I'm Wayne Green from the United Kingdom, and I'm a private academic on international relations. I have been involved in Azerbaijan and Armenia some time ago. I was also interested in very much in Somalia and also very much in China. It seems to me, actually, and I would like to question Benedetta on her analysis. One is, what we've really seen over the last 10 years really is a failure of international relations itself, and policymakers such as yourselves involved in this area. We've gone from a liberal perspective now to, I would suggest, a conservative form of realism. And does it not seem, and it seems to me, what is required really within the balance of the power of the West versus the East, within international law and international relations, is a new form of consciousness, a new form of philosophical concept towards a more interplanetary process. For example, we see, for example, China looking at an informed, flexible form of security, not a formal sense of security, but a flexible, informal. How do you deal with that? Secondly, I'd look at the notion of Russia. Russia, as we can see, is being squeezed between China, squeezed between Turkey, squeezed between the West, and therefore being put into a corner with strategic weapons and nuclear weapons as well. And I'm very concerned that Russia is not going away. We also have the issue of the environmental issue, and so therefore should we not more look towards more of, I say, a planetary process of integrated security, and how do we deal with that? How do we deal with this in 50, 60 years' time with this process rather than with communications with Russia and China? Because you've already said there is no diplomacy or communications at the moment, but very narrow form of communications.
Well, Dr. Benedetta.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions, and I'll try to answer them in starting with the first one. And of course, it's nice to see you virtually, and I remember very well Pitch and the Youth Summit. And I think of course I am a little biased because, as I said, we played a role in the drafting of the concept. So you will allow me you will allow me to say that I think we did quite well on this particular topic, but of course the real judges of that are external observers such as yourself and civil society, and two, of course, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating, as they say, in the sense that the strategic concept sets the direction of travel, but of course now we have to implement it and do the work and deliver on those agreed level of ambitions, and that will be the proof of success. But if I start from point one, as you rightly mentioned, and as I mentioned, and as I also referenced before, the WPS agenda is for the first time included in the NATO strategy. But I think the point that we found to be adding value, it's not just the recognition of the importance of this agenda, that's there nice and well, but the advancement in terms of policies that so far as NATO we had really thought about the WPS agenda, and then more specifically the human security agenda, as mostly focused on what NATO does in its missions and operations out of area. This is because, of course, a lot of the initial guidelines and thinking and policies really were shaped by our operations first in the Balkans and then in Afghanistan. So we had really a focus, an operational focus on what we do when we are out of area, which is really important and remains central to what we think about this agenda. But I think the strategic concept goes a lot further in saying, well, actually, this is not just about, we cannot just integrate and mainstream and think about human security and WPS in the context of missions and operations. We have to do exactly the same when it comes to our deterrence and defense, to the ways we deal with partnerships, and we really have to mainstream and integrate these perspectives into everything we do, because there is no compartmentalization. It's an artificial distinction. This has to be integrated in every aspect, which of course gives our special representative for women, peace and security, Renée Fellin, what I'm sure you have interacted with, I think just the right platform to do her work, which of course she's doing incredibly well, but it gives her also the platitude to broaden the agenda and to look at deterrence and defense in a way that they hadn't done before. And I think in terms of policy development, that's very much what they're thinking about. I actually just sat down with her today, so that's why I had it fresh on my mind. But I would definitely recommend, as you have other NATO guests, I would highly recommend to have her give you a little bit of a post-strategic concept update, because they are really taking this policy ambition and operationalizing it through their engagements, their work, and their expansion of the human security agenda. They're using more youth, so there's a lot that they're doing. But the point of the strategic concept was to give us a shared assessment that all of this matters, that all of this is not tangential, that all of these are strategic enablers of our way to approach security. So from our perspective, I think it's a good starting point. It's of course not the end of the road, but that's the same with everything that is written in any policy document. If you just write it and don't do it, then it's not good enough. But I think in terms of setting the level of ambition, we are we're quite forward-leaning. Then in terms of things, I'll broaden it a little bit, but I'll focus. I'll then go to the Western Balkans and Kosovo and our eastern neighborhood. But this is a really important question, and I think in the strategic concept itself, I'll go back to the document, and then I'm also going to what we're doing. In the strategic concept itself, there is, I think, a clear recognition of a few, related facts. One is, if we look at the future, there's many things we do not know, of course, but one thing that we can guess is that instability in our neighborhood will not be going away anytime soon. And if you look at 2010, we really thought a lot about fragility and instability as something that we only have to worry about in our southern neighborhood. So that was a lot the focus. And today, we're not saying that it's not a concern, it remains a concern, but I think especially with the aftermath and the longer term impact of Russia's devastating and unprovoked war in Ukraine, we're going to see instability on two flanks. So it's about the southern neighborhood, but also the eastern neighborhood. And we have to really think about it more in those more holistic terms. Then when we look at our eastern neighborhood, I think that you are absolutely correct that our Western Balkans are a key area of concern, but also of focus and of interest. In fact, there are a few regions in the world that are identified in the concept as of strategic interest to Euro-Atlantic peace and stability. The Western Balkans is the first amongst them. The Black Sea region is the second. Of course, these are European regions, and of course, what happened in these regions, of course, has a direct impact on allied security. So that's a clear recognition, which I think is important. We didn't have it as clearly reflected in prior strategic documents, but of course, in terms of how we look at the region, right now the focus is, as I said, on what can we do to better support partners in our broader neighborhood. And of course, as you know very well, the security needs are different in our southern partners or eastern partners. But when we come to our eastern partners, we really want to lean in on issues like boosting their resilience, boosting their ability to counter hybrid threats, working with them on cybersecurity, working on countering coercion, and of course there is a capacity building and training, but also political support element to all of these agendas. But I think the overall, if I had to make a long story short, the overall political goal, I would say stability, peace in these regions is key to our own peace and stability. We cannot really separate it, and so we really have to make a concerted effort. And of course, the Minister of Kosovo, we have been following very, very, very closely, as you've seen in the news, and NATO has, of course, not been involved in the political element, but has been supporting for many years the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. It's been for years supporting the efforts of the European Union, and it's also been, of course, ready on the ground through its K4 deployment to make sure that its mandate, which is to ensure the safety and security of all communities in Kosovo, remains unchallenged. So I think we are very much ready operationally, but at the same time we're working with other international actors to support a broader political framework. There's so much more to say because it's a really important question, but I'll stop here just not to go too long. Then the last point, that was very, we could spend hours and hours talking about this last set of questions, but I would just start with a point. We'll start with a recognition, let's start with what I agreed in the analysis, and then maybe I'll tease out some of the elements where I potentially see things a little different. And the first point is, yes, I absolutely see that the rules-based international order, the liberal, the democratic rules-based international order that is under significant pressure. There has been for a while. I don't think there's any denying that. In our own strategy, in our own assessment, we see assertive authoritarian powers making a deliberate effort to push back against the rules-based international order, both by attempting to set up parallel alternative structures, but even more significantly by trying to hollow it out from within. And we see, for example, China in the international system. So through its work in the United Nations or other technical bodies. So we do see very much that the international order, as you said, has is under severe strain. And in the analysis the Allies have made, looking at their security environment, what they say that this matters. Our prosperity, our peace, our security have been tightly linked to that international order. So threats and challenges to that order are also something that affect us, and they can potentially have an impact on our democracy, on our society, and on our values. So of course we take them very seriously. Then on the broader point, which is in a world of strategic competition, those strategic competitors are going nowhere, I think we would all agree. And that's why the point is, how do we have a modus operandi under which we can have shared rules, and we can have more predictability. That's certainly in all of our interests. But we also have to be cognizant of reality. For example, when it comes to the Russian Federation, I don't think that anybody could. I don't think that after the end of the Cold War, I don't want to go too much into history, but for decades, NATO extended its cooperation to Russia. If you pick up our programs from the 90s, you can see how many dialogues, how many cooperation, how many visits, how many shared projects, how many sponsoring of their scientists, how much we extended and tried to build a strategic partnership. You see that we offered Russia things that we didn't offer any other partner, a NATO-Russia Council just for them, a founding act. There's so much that we had done, and we were building. But of course, this has to be reciprocal, and it has to be based on recognizing and respecting the same rules. Once Russia in 2014, and one could argue that trend had begun way earlier. We could have said that after the war in Georgia in 2008, but be that as it may, after the invasion, after our partner at the time, Russia, invades another sovereign country and forcibly annexes a piece of their territory, well, we can't just go on as that didn't happen. So since 2014, NATO changed its posture, but that change was due to Russia's behavior. And ever since 2014, we've kept the NATO Relations Council, we've kept the dialogue. Of course, we haven't gone back to business as usual, because the message has been stop forcibly occupying a sovereign country, and then we can talk. But I would say that we have, and perhaps as a completely personal point, I would say perhaps we're being even too nice after 2014 in trying to bring Russia back to the fold, in trying to give them carrots, in trying to entice them diplomatically to comply with the rules of international law. The reality is that we've tried, but the behavior hasn't changed. If I follow Russian behavior since 2014 after Crimea, it hasn't gotten softer. We've had hybrid attacks. We have the use of chemical weapons on the soil of light territory from the UK, so you know very well it's still free. We had a series of aggressive actions culminating in a fully fledged war, and it's not just a fully fledged war; it's a fully fledged war with a level of brutality that we haven't seen in decades on our continent. So the question is, you're absolutely right. The question of the longer term stability of the European security order will depend on finding a modus vivendi with Russia, that's for sure. They're not going anywhere. But at the same time, I would highly caution, again, personally cautious about the price of not standing up for our values and not supporting Ukraine. And Russia's strategic victory would have devastating consequences. And I think it would also be a terrible precedent. What would be next? If they're allowed to get away with this, what would be next? And what would other strategic competitors learn from this? What would China think about Taiwan? I just think that unfortunately our reality is one where, yes, of course we want stability, of course we want dialogue, of course we want to have shared rules in Europe. That's the only way for true sustainable peace. But first Russia needs to change its behavior. It needs to withdraw its troops. It needs to face some type of accountability for its horrific war crimes. It needs to have a political agreement that the Ukrainians, as a sovereign country, feel it's viable for their country. There's so much that needs to change. Yes, of course. The long term is not to isolate. The long term goal is always going to be that of finding a modus vivendi with Russia. If they're not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere. But today, it's very difficult to say how we do that. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of optimism.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yes, and I must say I can confirm, having been a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, integrating the delegation of the European Parliament to that NATO Parliamentary Assembly, having the Russian delegation present, participating as an observer, actually with more rights than the European Parliament delegation, because they could not only propose but actually do reports, which we couldn't. None of us as observers had voting rights, of course, but they could do more than we could, we European Parliament. And the attitude of the several delegations of Russia that I've seen there were always extremely hostile and even offensive. And I do remember in particular a member which Gennady Zyuganov was particularly outrageous. So yes, I mean, I always wondered how people could bear with that kind of attitude on the part of our Russian partners. And I think in the end, it's not so surprising that the developments are what they are now, with the aggression against Ukraine following the other aggressions that were mentioned, Georgia 2008, and of course already Crimea in 2014. Anyhow, let me again widen the question.
I'd like to ask
Yes,
a question.
please.
Is that possible?
Carla?
I'm Mr. Carla.
Okay, so hello, Dr. Benedetta Berti. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really illuminating. Thank you so much. My name is Carla Quevedo. I host a podcast together with Matilde Torres Pereira here beside me. We host a podcast on women. So we talk about women. We invite women to come in and speak about whatever they do, whether they're well known or not so well known. So I'd like to ask you two questions. One, which has nothing to do with this, but with what you were saying just now about accountability. So how do you see this happening in the future? Are we going to see Putin pay somehow for his war crimes, because that's what he's doing? Are we going to see him tried? And this is one question. But the question I had before you spoke about accountability has to do with this gender perspective that is on this document. By the way, the podcast is called Women Don't Exist. And it seems to me that before 2022, you didn't have this gender perspective. If I understood you correctly, you didn't have this gender perspective in your document. So what is this exactly? Is it bringing more women to the table? Is it, what is it exactly? Could you speak a little bit more about this? Thank you so much.
We have Mariana Andre from.
Yes, hello, thank you for giving the word. Thank you, Benedetta, for your presentation and all your words. I have a question.
Can you say, Mariana, from where you are? I mean, what?
Yes, of course. I'm from Portugal, an executive board member of the Europe-Atlantic Treaty Association, like my colleague Maria Luisa Mireira. And I'm very interested in NATO issues and all the positions that NATO is taking during all these years. And actually, I was in the Balkan Studies event during these weekends in Ljubljana, talking about the Western Balkans. However, my question is about Arctic region. In the strategic concept of NATO, we don't see a specific part where the Arctic is concerned. So I would like to try to understand how NATO is looking to this region, since we have a lot of movements from Russia and China already in the region, and how can this be a challenge for the security in the future? Thank you so much.
Is there any other, a third question?
I have a question here.
Mathilde, you go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mathilde Torres Pereira. I host a podcast with Carla. I'm a journalist and also a cultural programmer here in Lisbon. My question has to do with the language of the document. There are some concepts that I think can be quite worrying from a civilian standpoint as an observer. I think that when we talk about resilience and neighborhood stability, it implies, it can imply non-action. And we know that when there is a conflict, lots of collateral damage will fall to civilian organizations. So my question is, I mean, it's $1 million question. Without a centralized decision center, how will the MO proceed apart from strategic concepts? I mean, I think this question has been asked here 3 or 4 times already, but the question we all have in mind is how international policymakers will proceed in order to help civilian collateral damage from this very, very dangerous conflict. And also when we talk about not being in a Cold War kind of era, the truth is that we know that unfortunately history looks a little bit familiar at this point in time with some of the, at least from an Eastern perspective, I'd say that there is some parallelisms from that era. So that's, I mean, good luck with answering the question.
Go ahead, Dr. Benedetta. Go ahead, Dr. Benedetta.
All right, and maybe I will. Maybe you will help me out if I miss something, because there's a lot of substance. Let me start with the. I'll combine the first and the third question in terms of the way forward when it comes to WPS, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. I think that's really, really important. But I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. But first of all, one very important point of clarification that I need to provide, because I don't want to give the impression that for NATO we didn't have anything about the WPS agenda for decades, and then we just suddenly realized that it's important and put it in the 2022 strategic context. Thankfully, that's not the case. But what I meant to say, this is the first NATO strategy. So we've had 8 of them since 1949. This is the first one that really embeds and gives a prominent role to peace and security. But the reason why we're able to do that, it's because for the past 2 decades, the organization has been really working on creating a women, peace and security agenda that is intersectional, that is broad, that builds on Resolution 1325, but really adapts it to the context of the needs and security needs and challenges of the alliance. So what do we do? Over the, it's 20 years of work, so I'm going to try to be as quickly, to be as succinct as possible. But not only did we have a framework, a policy, an action plan, but on that basis we started really embedding gender perspectives. First of all, in the way we do our training, our missions, and our operations. So, for example, by creating a network of gender advisors that are deployed on the ground and helping in all our missions and operations. So that's one. of course, another aspect is that at the same time we are not just working on the as you all know, 1325 has many different angles. One is how to recognize and deal with the fact that conflict has an inordinate impact on women. And we've done that through our gender advisor, by investing in our policy, in our in a very, I would say, forward-leaning and one of the best practices that are out there in terms of our policy on sexual counter-just sensual exploitation, on really dealing with the gender dimension of conflict. So that's one aspect of how we have mainstream 1325. But of course, as you know, 1325 is not just about women as victims of conflict. It's also about how to empower women, how to give them a voice at the table, how to increase participation of women. So it's a long-term commitment to really build a more diverse, more just, more sustainable understanding of security. So on that front, we've also have a policy that builds on, that embeds the principles of integration, that embeds the principle of how to integrate, incorporate gender perspective, bring women at the table, and we've done that within NATO by increasing our not just our gender ratio in the organization, but also our ratio of women in high and senior leadership position, but also by having a gender perspective civil society advisory group that works with our Women, Peace and Security team and tries to bring the perspective of women and women's rights as human rights into the agenda that works also now intersectional, cross-generational, including women leaders, young and more senior. So I would say that, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to give you 1,000 different signs to explain that really we did not just start it in 2022. That would have been really shameful, so I want to correct that perception. But just to say that what we're doing here with the strategic compass is recognizing the work, codifying it, and putting it at the center of how we look at security. So that's quite important because we're saying this has to be integrated, has to be mainstreamed, and really has to be a long-term commitment that we build into organization. So that's a little bit of that, and of course we're doing that, and I have to say that not just because it's my boss, but because we have a lot of important champions of the gender agenda at NATO, starting with very important allies from our leadership, including and starting with the Secretary General, who's a male ally and a supporter of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So all of this is just to tell you that we are codifying, we're building it, we're expanding it. But luckily, we didn't start now. We started 20 years ago. I'm sorry to keep referring to Irene Fellin, our Women, Peace and Security representative, but she can really give you the ins and outs of all the work that we've done.
She will.
So that's
She will, of course. Yes.
She was great. She's great. I'm just a big fan, so that's why I bring her up. And she can do a much better job than me in this. But just to say that we have, I think, not just the political aspirations, but a very serious track record to prove that we are doing. We're not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk. The same is true for human security, which goes to the other questions of how do we work on mitigating the impact of conflict on civilians. NATO is, and this is something that I know from my previous job, I used to work in the humanitarian field, and when it comes to protection of civilians, I have to say that that's one of the reasons why I knew NATO. It's one of the organizations which has one of the most extensive, most well-developed policies on protection of civilians. It's a best practice in the field. It's something that not just we apply to our own missions or operations, but we also integrate it and we train our partners. It's also something that we bring to our network of over 38 partners around the world. We have extensive dialogues with civil society, with the humanitarian sector, with the International Committee for the Red Cross. So it's again something where we have a very solid record. Does that mean it's perfect and there's no work to be done? No, there's always more work to be done. We know that wars are becoming more protracted, more complex, more and more fought among civilians. So this is something that we cannot afford to say job done and move to the next. It's an ongoing work, but I think we can be relatively proud of our framework when it comes to rules of engagement, protection of civilian framework, children and armed conflict framework. So just to tell the positive version of the story, but of course, as hands up on all of this, if not, it's something that we're going to continue working on because it's incredibly important. What did I miss?
Arctic.
Sorry, I got.
Arctic.
Oh, the Arctic! Sorry. I got very excited about WPS. Now I'll go back to the Arctic. No, the Arctic is that's a really, really important question because, well, for various, well, first of all, because I agree with your assessment. When it comes to the high north and the Arctic, that's certainly a region of the world where we see geopolitical competition playing out. We see that. We see also in the past few years, the Arctic has been more militarized. Of course, Russia has always been and remains an Arctic power, but we see in terms of its bases, in exercises, its use in the Arctic as that's an upward trajectory. So the Arctic is more militarized. We also see countries like China that have developed an Arctic strategy, are developing capabilities, including icebreakers, nuclear power icebreakers. They will be the country in the world with the highest number after they have completed their capability development program, etc., etc. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. The high north is becoming an arena of geopolitical competition. Because of the effects of climate change, I think that trend is only going to increase. For example, with the ice melting, we'll have new shipping routes being opened that will also fuel competition. And very significantly, of course, this can also have an impact on Euro-Atlantic stability and peace. You're correct that the strategic concept doesn't focus predominantly on the Arctic, but it does say, in talking about looking at our strategic environment, it does recognize that there are vulnerabilities and that Russia's actions in the Arctic in the high north can have an impact on our ability to reinforce, so to connect the Atlantic, to connect North America to Europe, and can be a challenge to maintaining freedom of navigation, open sea and under cable steel communication. So there is a recognition that this is something we need to pay growing attention to. And then I would say that in terms of what we're doing, NATO over the last few years has really increased situational awareness, so more intelligence sharing, more reporting, more sharing of the strategic picture in the Arctic, but also more exercising in the high north to be able to respond to any contingencies. And of course, last but not least, I would say after the completion of this accession process and the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO. Of course, it's true that our area, it's true that the high north will gain even more importance. Strategic direction north will be even more important in the way we look at our deterrence and defense. So all of this is just to say that I think that's an excellent question, and we're looking very carefully about how we can increase our preparedness, our capabilities, our ability to exercise together, and our strategic awareness of the developments in the high north, because competition is heating up there too. So I think that's where there's much more to say, but also.
Thank you. And I think now we turn to our last round of questions. And I see Valentina Marcelino.
Yes.
Valentina,
hello.
you have the floor.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Benedetta. It was really nice to listen to your wise words.
Valentina, you should say you're a Portuguese journalist covering
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a
defense
Portuguese
and
from
security
Diário de Notícias. I don't know if this subject diverts from the main topic. If so, I understand that you don't answer, but I think we can speak about it's about cyber defense and cyber security. What I want to know if do you felt a big increase of cyber attacks after the war against member states. And what NATO do to support the member states to defend themselves of cyber attacks?
And I think if I don't see any other hands raised, I'll have a few questions too. And given exactly what you've just told us in terms of the importance of the protection of civilians and also of the upholding of values in the context of the new strategic concept, what lessons were drawn from Afghanistan? And what lessons are being drawn from Ukraine? Because I mean, I am one of the people who was very, all my life, since this was developed in the framework of the UN, attached to the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect, then followed by a broader concept of human security. But that's exactly what we see neglected, both in Afghanistan and in Ukraine. Because if we adopt this approach that we defend every inch of our territory, but don't care what happens in the inches behind our territory, and of course what happens is, of course, kind of horrendous suffering that the Ukrainians are experiencing. How do we reconcile this with our values? Then, in the EU and in the context of common security and defense policy, I worked a lot, we worked a lot all these years on the notion of strategic autonomy to come to the conclusion that the very basics, for instance, independency on energy, was simply completely neglected, to say, to be euphemistic. Now, you've mentioned the importance of this partnership with the EU, but we just heard a State of the Union speech by President von der Leyen, which was actually very good in many respects, namely about Ukraine, but no word on European defense effort. Okay, there was a lot of words about exactly correcting this strategic autonomy, namely in terms of energy independence. But no real, nothing added on defense. I know that at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there were lots of pledges that Europeans would indeed catch up. And of course this can be done, this will be important in European framework, but as well in NATO framework, because most of the members are members of both. Finally, and I asked this question about strategic autonomy because of course we are seeing how we missed this now regarding Russia. We missed in the past, trying to correct it. But we will definitely miss it. We are missing it as well regarding China, the strategic competitor. Nobody has mapped how much most of member states are totally dependent on China, namely on China technology that China controls militarily, namely cyber technology. And my third question is about what's the evolution in terms of nuclear deterrence? Because I believe that NATO was in denial of the nuclear threat because relying on MAD, mutually assured destruction. But now we're not back into a Cold War. We are in a very hot war, actually the hottest I can remember, because I've never lived in a context where one nuclear power would threaten the world. And that's exactly the situation we are in. Maybe threats are not that credible, because as the Sting would sing, the Russians love their children too. But, you know, you never know.
Or do they?
They do, but the question is that there are some crazy people always, and you know, lost by 100, lost by what what's the changes, or what's the evolution of the thinking that the new strategic concept brings in terms of the nuclear deterrence? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible so that, and try to, 8 to 9, in the next maximum 10 minutes to address this easy question: cybersecurity, lessons from Afghanistan, how to deal with war crime in Ukraine, and at the same time our deterrence and defense posture, nuclear deterrence, strategic autonomy, strategic independence in China. Okay, wish me luck. I'll start with the first question, which I think was very, very important, cyber defense. I mentioned the word cyber throughout my short presentation, but of course you're absolutely, I think you're absolutely correct to zoom in there, because it is one of the key dimensions of future warfare, or current and future warfare. So in that sense, it's very important to put the emphasis there. In terms of where NATO is on cyber, we have done, I would say, quite a bit of homework, especially since 2016. Today, the Alliance really, in addition to a cyber policy and a number of very important policy instruments, but conceptually, we look at defense and deterrence over 5 operational domains, which means what we're saying is that what we do in the conventional domain, so what we do on land, at sea, in the air, we need to be able to be just as credible and just as deliberate in cyberspace and in outer space. So it's one of our operational domains. We've also said quite clearly that when it comes to collective defense, so Article 5, we don't define exactly what armed attack means in terms of triggering Article 5, because of course that wouldn't be great for deterrence if we gave our adversaries a list of everything they can and cannot do. But we have said that an attack in cyberspace can lead to the invocation of Article 5. So we say armed attack is not just defined in conventional domain, it can be also cyber attack, both one big cyber attack or a series of the cumulative effect of many cyber attacks. So in that sense, in terms of our defense and deterrence posture, I would say it's very clear that cyber defense, cyber security are very much at the center of how we think about deterrence and defense. That's of course, it's a very complex question, so I'm being as succinct as possible. But in terms of what we do, it is of course cyber defense in terms of our networks, in terms of our infrastructure, but it's not just that, it's also integrating cybersecurity consideration into everything we do. It's also about thinking about how do we think and apply deterrence and defense in cyberspace. It's about sharing intelligence. So it is, I would say, a very robust approach, and one of the files where I think the Alliance is really moving in the right direction. Of course, and then you mentioned in the aftermath of the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine, I think the jury's still out. In the public space, there's a lot of discussion between experts whether we had overestimated the potential cyber threat from Russia, or underestimated, or many kind of analyzed the beginning of the war and said, well, we were surprised that there weren't as many cyber attacks as we thought. Of course, it's difficult to know who's right and who's wrong, because we're in the middle of it, right? Very much in the middle of the conflict. But I would say that it's really too early to draw any long-term lessons, at least from my point of view on this particular question. In other words, I don't think this war is showing us that cybersecurity or cyber defense is any less important, and I don't think that some of the tactics and toolkits that apply to Ukraine wouldn't necessarily apply to the way a potential conflict could unfold between the Russian Federation and the Allies. So in that sense, I'm very cautious to draw too many, because it didn't happen there, it will not happen in a different context. But I think overall the message is clear. We need to continue to boost our defenses and to think about cybersecurity and integrate it into everything we do, which is as quickly as I can answer this really important question. I'll try to be even more succinct on the second question on Afghanistan. Of course, we could spend hours talking about it, but I would say that there's NATO has been talking about its lessons learned process publicly. It's of course a process that have looked at the military dimension and the political dimension. There's many lessons to be learned. One that I've already indirectly referenced many times in my presentation is the importance of really building on the prevention toolkit, the importance of working with partners, the importance of we've seen the large-scale nation-building efforts are very difficult to do. It's very, very difficult to obtain longer-term impact. And we also see a general sense of fatigue from the international community when it comes to this massive engagement. So it's really important that we tailor our toolkit and are able to be a little bit more nimble, I would say, when we think about crisis contribution to stabilization. But of course, this is such a short answer that I know it's a lot unsaid, but the reason why I want to be so short is because I don't want to take all your evening, but I still want to at least have 2 minutes for each of the other questions. One is the really, really important question of how do we deal with the fact that there is a terrible, unprovoked, brutal war raging in the middle of Europe, and of course, NATO, as you mentioned in the beginning, is not a party to the conflict. NATO allies are supporting Ukraine, including the military and lethal assistance. NATO is supporting Ukraine with non-lethal assistance. We are supporting Ukraine, and the Secretary General has been very vocal. We will do so for as long as it takes. But that's not the same to say NATO is not party to the conflict. And rightly so, you raised the dilemma. How can that be? How can we let all of this happen in the middle of Europe? And it's a very complex. I don't have a good answer, but what I can tell you is where I sit. Well, I don't have that much influence, of course, but where my boss is, the Secretary General, when he looks at things, it's clear that on the one hand, we have a very clear mission as NATO, and that is to ensure the security and defense of our allies. And that comes first. And everything we do, that's why we were created, that's why we're set up. So that's also why when the war started in February, NATO's first reaction was, how do we make sure that we shield all of our allies and make sure that this war does not expand? And that's very important, and that will remain our first task. That will remain our first job. How do we thicken our eastern flanks? How do we reassure allies on our eastern flanks? How do we make sure that our deterrence and defense is strong and credible so that this horrible conflict does not expand and does not affect our allies? So that's step one. But at the same time, of course, what is happening in Ukraine is harrowing and terrible, but there is a balance. We are very much, we want to support and we do support Ukraine, but we also do not want this conflict to expand. And certainly, we know that an expansion of the conflict between Russia and NATO would be a very, very, how do I say? This is absolutely something that we cannot risk, and we are very deliberately making sure that we support Ukraine without leading to an escalation to the conflict. So it's a very hard balance to manage, admittedly. And of course, we can talk about the moral and ethical, what more can we do to support Ukraine? That's absolutely true, but also we have a moral and ethical, I would say, imperative to our citizens not to lead us into World War III. We have to keep the balance. So it's I don't have a good answer, but that's what we're trying to do. Support Ukraine, ensure a Russian failure, not expand the war. I think this would be my personal, that we try to navigate, but it's very complicated. So I take the question. It's certainly a question we ask ourselves as well. Nuclear deterrent, very quickly, yes. For many decades after the end of the Cold War, I feel that we had, as an alliance, but also as different countries, we are different as a transatlantic community, and especially on this side of the Atlantic, so especially on the European side. I don't want to say neglected, but let's say put the nuclear element of our deterrence equation to the side. We've sort of forgotten how important it is, and I think this conflict and the current situation really shows how our deterrence posture works. And NATO's deterrence and defense posture is very clear. It's about conventional forces, it's about missile defense, but it's also about nuclear deterrence. And that's a key element. That's the ultimate guarantee of our security. And that's why in the 2022 concept, you see this said very clearly. NATO has a long-term goal and will support a long-term goal of a world without nuclear weapons. So we do not believe that a world where Russia and China have nuclear weapons and we don't to be a safer world. And as long as there will be nuclear weapons, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance, and we will continue to make sure that our nuclear deterrence is safe, that is exercised, and that is credible, so that no adversary makes any mistaken calculation and tries to test the credibility of our defense and deterrence posture. So I would say, in a way, unfortunately, the current security situation, and you're absolutely right, reminds us that ultimately our deterrence and defense rests on the credibility of our extended nuclear deterrence guarantees, and that remains really central. And that's not something that in many European countries, I'll start with mine, Italy, it's very well understood, and we probably have to have that conversation with our publics in a way that we haven't needed to for a few decades. So unfortunately, that's the world we live in. I agree with you. Last but not least, strategic autonomy or here. How to do this very quickly. 2 points. One is I absolutely agree with you that the issue of mitigating strategic dependencies has to be front and center while we think about our future of our security. We're having a very long overdue as Europeans discussion about energy security and the diversification of energy suppliers, and that's really, really important. I'm glad to see this conversation happening. I share with you that we should have had this. We should have started a long time ago. And I very much hope that one of the lessons that we draw from this crisis and from what will be inevitably very difficult months ahead is that we become much more deliberate and we don't sleepwalk from one strategic dependencies to another. So yes, I completely agree. When we think about strategic dependencies on potential peer competitors, we cannot just work on freeing ourselves from dependency on Russian oil and gas to walk into, let's say, dependency on China for chips. No, we have to be very deliberate in how we do this. And I think it's a big challenge. It's not necessarily, here I'm talking more personally, it's not necessarily a challenge where NATO will be in the lead. This is something where our allies, like sovereign nations, the European Union will be in the lead. But yes, it also affects NATO because it affects our security. So it's something that we are also monitoring carefully. And on the defense element, I think from my point of view, I'm always not super keen on the strategic autonomy frame because I think it gives us a little bit of an illusion, and I try to be as brief as possible, an illusion that it is possible to think about the defense of Europe not in a transatlantic framework. I don't think that's the case. I think what I prefer to think about, again, personal 2 cents, take it or leave it, is how to strengthen the European pillar of NATO, to have European countries take a greater share of responsibility for our shared security. So to do more, spend more, acquire more capabilities. You work through the European Union to jointly procure, to jointly develop capabilities. So really strengthen our role as Europeans in providing for our own security. And that's, I think, it's very important. But at the same time, when I look at the map of Europe, when I look at reality, I think that to me, the only, maybe I'm wrong, but to me, the only sustainable way to think about European and European security in the future is to think about it in a transatlantic framework. And that means, yes, the European Union with a very important role, but working with our North American allies, working with the United Kingdom, which, yes, it's no longer in the European Union, but remains a central player when it comes to European security and will always be one. Norway in the north, Turkey in the south, we can talk about this for ages, but the point is the defense of Europe requires an approach that is broader than just the European Union as an actor, although I think the European Union has an increasingly more important role to play. So in that sense, that's when I hear strategic autonomy. I'm like, no, maybe not exactly, but yes, more responsibility, like in a transatlantic framework. But then again, you've asked the NATO person, so obviously I give you a transatlantic answer.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Benedetta Berti. It was really fascinating to listen to you. Of course, I would have a comment to your last point that, of course, we keep our fingers crossed that we don't get another US president that thinks that NATO is obsolete, because this is what in a way has prompted people to think that indeed strategic autonomy was really necessary. But we are all learning in this with the evolution, and I definitely see what the importance of what you told us, namely on this question of nuclear deterrent, which must be a very high concern now in the minds of everybody with the evolution in Ukraine. And President Biden, when 2 days ago he said, don't to Mr. Putin, obviously I think in the framework of the concept, the strategic concept, is of course signaling that all consequences will be there if his warning will not be heard, but that doesn't mean necessarily reciprocating in nuclear terms. There is plenty in the arsenal of the NATO allies with conventional powers to actually achieve the kind of consequences that have obviously to be met if indeed any attempt would be attempted or launched. Anyhow, it was really brilliant, your expose. I must say, Lieutenant Colonel Diana de Moraes had already spoken a lot about your amazing knowledge and skills to communicate, and I absolutely can now corroborate. We really appreciate taking your time. You know, in Brussels is 1 hour later, so thank you so much as well for staying up in the office, I think, until so late. And it was really fascinating for us to listen to you. I hope that if you ever come to Portugal, we'll have the opportunity to meet you personally. Also here to continue our discussion here in this framework with Vlad. It would be very appropriate. And thank you really for this very encompassing explanation about what the thinking is in NATO in the framework of the new strategic concept adopted in 2022 and in view of the security threats and challenges that we are experiencing. Thank you so much, Dr. Benedetta Berti.
Thank you. And thank you so much.
All. Normally, WIIS is open only to women, but this time we decided, because of course this is a matter that is of interest for everybody, so I'm glad that we had a few men as well attending. Thank you for their participation, and thank you for listening and helping us indeed reflect upon these crucial questions for the governance, not just of our countries, but as well of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will now.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You all too.